Greetings everyone. This is going to be an introductory video to the aorist tense in Greek. This topic's taken up in our textbook in Croy chapter 13 and 14. And the easiest way to jump into the aorist tense is to show you that it's the third principal part and get a look at it. So we have luo as the easiest verb to conjugate, the most regular. The first principal part is luo in the present. The second principal part is luso with that characteristic sigma. And the third principal part, the aorist, is elusa. And the aorist is a simple past tense. It's far more common than the imperfect. And whereas the imperfect meant something like, I was untying, or habitually as a child, I untied the donkey every day, the aorist is a simple past. Yesterday, I untied the donkey. Let's get a look at the other forms. So if elusa is the first person singular, elusas is you untied. Eluse, he, she, or it untied, the third person singular. Elusamen, you should start to be discerning a pattern here. Elusate, that's what you were guessing. Elusan. And so with this full conjugation of the aorist in front of us, you can see two easy to identify components. One is, this has a temporal augment. And every rule we learned for temporal augments when we learned the imperfect still applies to the aorist. Every rule about where the augment goes in a compound verb, every rule about what will happen when the augment combines with the first letter of a verb, all those rules still apply. And so I'm not going to speak more about any unique features of the augment with the aorist tense. Just remember what you learned with the imperfect. The second thing you'll see is what look like a brand new set of endings. And I'm going to make the case later that these aren't all that new. But for now, you'll say, aha, sigma alpha seems to be pretty characteristic. Each one of these forms has a sigma and an alpha, sa, except for the third person singular, which just has se. We have our old epsilon. Okay, let's keep that in mind and do it with a new verb. This should be easy. Let's take pistuo, to trust. Pistuo in the future becomes pistuso, and in the aorist it will be epistusa. We have that augment, we have that sigma alpha ending, and we'll just keep all the same endings that we learned for the elusa. So again, you see, here's our temporal augment, and here are our new first aorist endings. Now, if you've got your thinking cap on, you might say to yourself, what will happen when that sigma alpha ending tries to get added to a verb that already ends with a consonant? Well, let's run that. Pempo in the future was pempso. And you remember why? Our characteristic sigma merged with the P of the stem. And all the rules that we learned for those combinations will still apply for the aorist. So if you're trying to imagine what the aorist will look like, you'll say to yourself, it's going to have an augment. It's going to be pemp plus sa. And oh, I think I know what's going to happen when that P combines with that sigma. It's going to be the exact same thing that happened before. Epempsa, which sounds just like the uncontracted form. And again, all the rules that we learned in the past still apply. So once you know that, you can just add your usual aorist endings. Sa, sas, se, sam, and sate, san. So pemp sa means I sent, rather than I was sending or I used to send in the past, which is what the meaning of the imperfect would be. So far, so good. Let's ask ourselves one more question. Here's our simplest verb again, luo. What about the infinitive? Well, for the present infinitive, the ending is just epsilon iota nu, luane. The future infinitive, which is exceedingly rare, is lusane. And I will tell you that the aorist infinitive ending is psi. Still has that sigma, still has that alpha. And you would say to yourself, okay, the aorist infinitive will be elusai. But this is incorrect, and the reason is the infinitive never has an augment. So that temporal augment has to be removed. And when we learn the three principal parts, the temporal augment will already be baked into the aorist. Luo, luso, elusa. Which means to form the infinitive, you'll have to imagine removing that temporal augment and then adding our ending. So the actual aorist infinitive is lusai. And you notice the gap. We have taken off the temporal augment. Now, let's do that with one other verb, and then I can already anticipate a question that might be forming in your minds. Let's just do this with pistuo. The present infinitive, to believe, is pistuane. And the aorist infinitive, which has no augment, we're going to add psi, but we're not going to add an augment. Let's get rid of that epsilon. It's going to be pistu psi. All right, let's simplify our chart. We'll leave the future out of this because it's so rare. The question I suspect you're asking is, what then is the difference? How would I translate the aorist infinitive? What's the difference between pistuane and pistusai? Let's put these in a sentence and I'll answer your question. Thelo pistuane to theo. I want to believe God. I want to trust God. Remember that the verb pistuo takes a dative as its object. Let's do the same thing with the aorist infinitive. I want thelo pistusai to theo. If pistuo takes a dative as its object, it will do so in all tenses. How will we translate this? Well, the answer is exactly the same. I want to trust God. And the reason for this is that the aorist infinitive has no augment. We already established that. But here's the important point. When the aorist lacks the augment is called the temporal augment because it has to do with tempus, time. As soon as we lose that temporal augment, we lose anything to do with past time. This is a hard thing to learn on day one of learning the aorist. Because I recently said the aorist is a simple past tense. Well, it's a simple past tense when it has the temporal augment. When it doesn't have the temporal augment, It doesn't have anything to do with past time. The next question you might be asking is, then what is the aorist in its heart of hearts? If when it loses this thing in red, this temporal augment, it loses its connection to the past, what is it? That is a legitimately difficult question. And I guess the simplest answers are that it's kind of some sort of punctiliar idea. But books have been written about this question, what is the purpose of the aorist? And although books have been written, full studies have been devoted to this question, there isn't any real consensus. It's actually kind of a hard problem. If you can come up with a fresh answer, you can get rich and famous, or as rich and famous as grammarians become. In the meantime, I'll ask you to just remember the rule, and this will be very important because later we're going to learn a lot of other types of aorist that also don't have the augment. Okay, I'll repeat that at the end of this video because it's important. In the meantime, let's just mess around with some other forms. We have seen another type of ending on our verbs. Verbs like poruomai, which are deponent. The future of this verb is porusamai. And the aorist will be eporusamein. This is a deponent verb. It's deponent in all three of its first principal parts, which means there's nothing passive or middle about it. It just means to go. And so eporusamein just means I went. And the rest of the chart is also going to be aorist middle. Now, there was no way to know that the third principal part of this verb would be deponent. But once you learn the principal parts, poruomai, porusamai, eporusamein, then you know this is a deponent verb. It uses middle deponents. Remember, in the present, we can't tell if it's middle or passive. But in the future, we have a future middle, which is really only used for deponents. It's a different form. And in the aorist, right now, with the third principal part, we're only learning aorist middles, aorist actives, and aorist middles. And the aorist middles will be used for verbs like poruomai that are deponent. And you will see that the aorist middle still, for the most part, has its characteristic sigma alpha. The one apparent exception is the U form. And if you read the note in Croy's textbook, you'll see that it's not even an exception. It's actually just a contraction. You can memorize it whatever way you find more convenient. And you can memorize these endings as sa, main, so, sa, ta, or you can kind of start to notice that it looks like there are two components. A sigma alpha, the sign of the aorist, and then a set of endings that aren't that unfamiliar. You've already seen main something, ta, metha, stha, unta. Those are the same secondary middle endings that we learned when we learned the imperfect middle and passive. So you can think about this as a single combination, sa-main, or you can think of it as two parts. The advantage of thinking of it as two parts is that you already know the second part, metha, stha, and ta. All right? Yeah, that was a little jiggle to remind you, these look familiar. Now, the next thing to do will be to put this verb in the infinitive. If you recall, the form of the present infinitive in the middle and passive was esthai. That was the ending. Not ain, but esthai. The middle aorist ending for the aorist infinitive will be sasthai. So the aorist infinitive for this verb will be porusasthai. And you can see there's our ending. We've gotten rid of the temporal augment. And to reiterate my prior point, it might be useful to think of sthai as an infinitive, a middle infinitive that you already sort of know. Because if you think of it that way, you can say, aha, I see a lot of similarity here. Okay, I'd like to reiterate the prior point. Infinitive doesn't have an augment, and the aorist infinitive has nothing to do with past time. First, let's write a present tense infinitive. Thelo poruisthai. I want to walk. Now let's do it in the aorist. Thelo porusasthai. We've just dropped in our aorist infinitive, and we know the aorist infinitive doesn't have an augment, so the aorist infinitive has nothing to do with past time, which means our translation is going to appear identical in English. I want to walk. It's going to drive you crazy for a while to translate aorist infinitives the same as you translate present infinitives. So let me say one other thing, and that is that the meaning, again, of this word aorist is literally, this is an alpha privative in Greek. It is the a horizo. It is the undefined tense, meaning it's really the default tense. So if you're saying, I want to walk, if you want to say, I want to walk in Greek, the default tense is to use the aorist infinitive. The infinitive is the default. You need a reason to use the present. The fact that we learn the aorist later on makes it feel foreign and alien and like some decision was being made. And it makes sense to learn the aorist later because it has some more complicated parts. But if you were really just trying to intuit the Greek language, you would learn the aorist first, and you would learn all the other tenses later. And you would just think of the aorist as the default undefined tense. So if it helps, say to yourself, when I see a sentence like thelo porusasthai, I'm not going to fuss about why did they choose the aorist. It doesn't have an augment. It has nothing to do with past time. To conclude, let's just remember our forms. The most important thing here is that we're learning a new principal part, the aorist. And it has a temporal augment in the indicative. It has a temporal augment in the form we memorize. And it has a new batch of endings, which are not altogether new. And finally, when we make the infinitive, we take the augment off, and we have to learn one more new ending, namely sai, that is the infinitive aorist ending, lusai.